this tutorial, we're going to look at how to add dimension and space to minimal techno style drum sounds. Dimension is very important because it occurs in every sound we hear in life, and without applying it to our music, things feel out of place and stale. Here we will use Live's built-in effects to add depth and style to our sounds. I have some simple drum loops and a bass line prepared. Let's quickly listen. Notice at this point that the drum sounds sound a bit dry. So the first thing I'd like to do is add some reverb. Reverb is very important. I like to think of it as the sound's shadow. So I'm going to use return tracks in the drum rack so we can apply one reverb to different sounds at different levels. So I open up my chain list and I'm clicking the IO and the R. And the R allows us to add a return chain to our drum rack. So if we right click this area, we get the option to create a return chain. So I'll click that. Now we have a return chain. And I'm just going into the browser and I'm just adding the default reverb preset. All right, so with this reverb, I'm going to create something similar to an old plate sound. The first thing I'm going to do is turn up the dry wet all the way to 100%. And now I'm going to have to use my send right here to control the amount of influence the effect will have on each sound. I'm going to change, or I'm just going to turn off the input processing. I don't want any of the sound to be filtered. I want all those frequencies coming in to be processed by the reverb. I'm going to bump up my pre-delay a bit, something like this. Now traditionally plate reverbs don't have much pre-delay, if any at all. I just kind of like the pre-delay kind of sound. Most of the time in minimal techno, the drums have very short decays at first. So I'll take the decay time down to around 450 milliseconds. Traditionally, plates have a very dense sound. All right, so we're going to add a bit of diffusion, something like that. And again, plate reverbs don't have much early reflections going on, but I kind of like the way Live's early reflections sound. So I'm just going to add a little bit of that as well. All right, and then I'm just going to modify this a little bit to take that up like so, and that down like that. And that kind of sounds good for me. I think it kind of takes away a little bit of the metallic character. So I'm going to start playback. And I'm going to use my rack mixer, as I think it's a little easier. So we have our snare, and this is our send to send some of the snare to the reverb. And notice we don't hear any of the reverb just yet. But now as I add some of the send, we can hear that the snare now has reverb on it. And let's go in and make some changes to the reverb. So let me just solo the snare so we can isolate the reverb sound. To get a decent plate sound, we have to turn the size control down. When we have a low value for the size control, we can get sounds close to springs or plates. I'm going to change the shape control to a lower value. With this setting, I think the reverb has a bit more bite to it. And I'm going to take the decay down a bit, as it still sounds a bit long for minimal tech drums. Now for the diffusion network, I'll use the low pass to get rid of the high end, as plates tend not to have much above 7 to 10 kilohertz. I'm actually going to cut it a bit more up top to help give us that dark minimal sound. Then I'll use the high pass to get rid of the lows, as they tend to create a muddy sound. Now let's add some reverb to the drum sounds. I want to be subtle here, as the basic minimal drum pattern typically doesn't have too much reverb, just enough to add some dimension. So let me start playback, and I'll start mixing while I'm doing that. So for the snare, I'm going to take the reverb down to about -10 dB or so of send. could hear that it adds a little bit of that shadow, that space to it. Now over to the shakers. Shakers I'm gonna add a lot. You could hear that with the shakers. Adds a bit more of like a fluffy sound to it. There's not too much attack on the shakers, so I'm gonna apply a lot. And a little to this one. And for the conga, I have about -7 dB or so. And the zap, let's check out the zap. And the zap I'll have a little bit more, as I feel it works well with this kind of a sound and places it a bit further back in the mix. Let's just add a little bit to the kick, not too much, just a little bit to kind of gel everything together. Alright, now let's go down to the reverb and play with the decay time a bit. I'm just going to bump up the decay time to about 375 milliseconds or so. Now let's check out what it sounds like without the reverb, kind of A/B it. Okay, so this is dry. This is with the reverb. So you can hear that it's very subtle, but it definitely adds a little something. You kind of gotta concentrate to hear it, but there's definitely something there. Now I'm going to add another reverb. This one will be more of a room style reverb and will complement and add emphasis to the plate-like reverb sound we already have. This one I'll keep pretty basic and just change a few settings. So I'm just going into my browser and I could just drag any effect into this area and it'll create another return for us. I'm going to add this mostly to the shakers, so I'll try to emphasize the high-end frequencies with this reverb. That being said, on the input, let me get rid of the high cut and let me cut some of the lows. Also going to cut the decay time down, as again I like the shorter reverbs and I think they work better for this minimal techno style. I'm going to turn the diffusion down a bit, as I don't want it as dense as the last reverb. And the reflections I'm going to turn up. And as with the last one, let's set up the spin like we had previously. And finally, I'm going to turn my dry wet all the way up. Let's start playback. And again, like I said, I was going to add a bit to the shakers. So let me cut back on the original. We don't want too much. And I think the zap sounds good. And again, I'm just cutting back on the original. Snare, I don't want too much. I think something like that works. And let me cut back the original. I'm just gonna bump up the decay time, about 100 milliseconds or so. And I'm just gonna pan them separately to make it a bit wider. Okay, so now that we have the reverbs mostly set up, let's go up and A/B with and without the reverb. So if I hold down Shift and select both of these tracks, I can turn the speaker or track activator on and off at the same time. So I'm going to use that to A/B the two. So let me hit play. So that's with reverb. That's without. With. So thanks a lot for checking this out, and make sure to stay tuned for part 2, where we'll add some insert effects to the different drum sounds.